Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's panel discussion on industry insights into Ontario's new excess soil regulation. We're going to get started today with a presentation to provide a brief overview of the regulation and changes that are intended to come into force for 2022. We'll cover the basics of the regulation and then spend some time focusing on delivery strategies. After the presentation, we're going to engage our panelists to provide more detailed insight into the regulatory changes and how they might impact various projects. We'll also make sure to take some time throughout that panel discussion to answer any questions you might have that are posed in the chat. So before we get started with the presentation, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items as well. So today's webinar is being recorded and a copy is going to be shared afterwards. We've got a great turnout for this presentation. So in order to keep things moving, all participants will be on mute for the session. However, the chat box is open for use. So we ask that as we're going through the presentation or throughout the panel discussion, if you do have any questions, please type them into the chat and we will do our best to respond. Given the number of participants we've got, and so that as moderators we can easily keep track of the questions, we do ask that you try to keep the chat limited to just questions posed for our panelists and our presenters. So I'll just start off with a brief introduction before we get into our presentation. So my name is Erica Ryder. I'm an environmental engineer and a qualified person, or a QP, based out of our Mississauga office. I've been working in the field of site assessment and remediation since about 2003, and I'm going to be one of the moderators for our discussion today, along with my colleague Joel Van Popta. Joel's a geoscientist in our Hamilton office and is also a QP with over 15 years of experience in site remediation and soil management. Providing the initial presentation today are Grace Ferguson and Tiana Robinson. Grace is a senior hydrogeologist and a QP out of our Waterloo office and has over 25 years of experience in site assessment, soil management, and remediation. Tiana Robinson is a senior hydrogeologist and a principal also based out of our Waterloo office and has over 15 years experience managing and leading excess soils projects, including developing innovative solutions for reuse, authoring tender specifications, and serving on ONEA's Excess Soils QP Steering Committee. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grace to get started with today's presentation.
Thanks, Erica. So first, as Erica said, we'd like to quickly run through a few of the basics regarding the new on-site and excess soil regulation for soil. Some of this may be very familiar to you and some may not. So we'd like to try and bring everyone onto the same page before we get into further discussion. So why is this new regulation being brought in? Well, owners have always been responsible for managing soil in an environmentally responsible manner. But up until now, there hasn't been the regulatory framework to clarify what's required and to enforce it. The existing waste regulation and standard specifications have been vague regarding excess soil. Ontario Regulation 406-19 provides clear enforceable rules regarding soil reuse, and it lays out a property owner's responsibility to manage excess soil leaving their site and how they can no longer contract out liability for its management to others. So let's cover off a few basic definitions and terminology that we'll be using throughout today's session. First of all, soil is defined as natural materials that have been broken down to a size of less than 2 millimeters diameter, including crushed rock. Excess soil is excavated soil or crushed rock that's removed from a site or a project area as it's defined in the regulation. The project area is defined by the area where soil is being excavated and can include adjoining properties that may or may not be owned by the project leader. A project leader is the entity who's ultimately responsible for decisions on the planning and implementation of the project. This is typically the owner or the developer. A reuse site is a property where soil is received and beneficially reused for things like backfilling, grading, or rehabilitating, but it doesn't include storing soil. There are other types of receiving sites as well, which include a Class 1 or Class 2 management site, local waste transfer facilities, and landfills. So now we'll look at the ways soil is typically moved around in Ontario and how the new regulation fits in. Here's a graphic outlining typical activities for soil movement, including aspects of the regulation you're likely already familiar with since the regulation is in effect now. The regulation has brought in rules for handling, storing, assessing, moving, and processing soil, whether on-site or off-site, and transporting soil between sites. If you are involved with a site that's currently generating excess soil, you need to understand the environmental quality of your soil. If you're in charge of hauling soil from a source site to a receiving site, you need to make sure that the driver of each load of soil can tell an inspector where their soil is from and where it's going, and who can provide more information. If you're receiving fill on your site, the source site will want to obtain written consent from you to take it. Now we'll move on to summarize what's coming for the start of 2022. So here we've highlighted some key changes that are coming as of January 1st. First of all, the involvement of a qualified person, or QP for short, will be even more critical since they will need to prepare the planning documentation that is necessary to show the soil quality is appropriate for the site it's taken to. The QP will support the project leader in the filing of a registry notice. The excess soil registry system will go live starting on December 1st, with filing requirements in effect as of January 1st. Most sites exporting excess soil will need to complete the planning requirements and file a notice. Reuse sites may also need to file a notice, depending on the volume of soil to be received. The same storage and transportation rules will be in place that are currently in effect, with the added requirements that the haulers will need to be able to produce documentation with specific information upon request for each load of soil they carry, and also a tracking system will need to be implemented by the project leader. Sometimes the decisions made to treat the excess soil as waste and send it to a landfill site. It's important to be aware that after January 1st, 2025, project leaders and haulers will not be able to dispose of excess soil at a landfill if its quality is suitable for reuse. Next, I want to lay out what's involved in the planning requirements under the regulation. So the planning requirements is a term used to reference assessments and documents that are used to understand soil quality and determine the appropriate reuse of soil. As you can see here, they include an assessment of past uses, a sampling and analysis plan, a soil characterization report, an excess soil destination assessment report. These all then support the registry filing. Soil quality is assessed using the Excess Soil Quality Standards, or ESQS. These are selected based on the characteristics of the proposed reuse site. There's limited leachate testing also required. Sometimes alternative site-specific standards are established using either the beneficial reuse assessment tool or a risk assessment. The regulation also includes special rules for handling certain common reuse scenarios, such as for salt-impacted soil and placement of soil on crop or pasture lands. Next, we'll move on to talk about some exemptions. You can see there's quite a few requirements and rules included in the regulation. And as we've noted on this slide, there are a few areas that might result in an exemption from some requirements. Your best approach, though, is to assume your project is not exempt and check with your QP early on in the process to see if there might be possibilities. It's important to remember that even with an exemption, the project leader is still responsible for the appropriate management of their soil. And another key consideration is that a desired reuse site's requirements may be over and above the regulations requirements. So I'd like to shift our focus now to just some specific considerations. First of all, what about liquid soil? Liquid soil could be generated in different ways. Perhaps you're cleaning out a stormwater management pond, or doing directional drilling or tunneling, or hydro excavation. Well, there's special requirements for storing, processing, and hauling liquid soil so that the liquid is prevented from escaping into the environment. The regulation allows certain liquid soil dewatering or processing to be carried out at the project area at certain other types of sites without having to get a waste ECA. This is good because excess soil that's placed at a reuse site is required to be dry, with some exceptions. And moving on, if you want to be a soil receiving site, there are some key things to confirm before you accept your soil, as listed here. You basically want to understand the quality of soil that you can accept, and if you have a QP advising you, and is there adequate documentation of soil quality by a QP, and is there tracking information from the source site? What's the volume you're going to receive and how quickly can you reuse it? And then as you set up to manage your stockpile, and manage your stockpiles, do you have an understanding of what your size limitations are and your setback distance restrictions? If not, do you then maybe need to look at being classified as a different type of receiving site or have an instrument? So next, we'll move on to discussing some delivery strategies for your projects, and I'll hand it over to Tiana here.
Thanks, Grace. This section was designed basically to answer FAQs that we have received over the past year or two. And what we're going to do here is we'll lay out some typical construction projects and where, as a soil generator, you will need to consider the new soil regulation in your overall project delivery. First, we'll discuss the project timelines and various points at which you will need to consider soil management. Then we'll demonstrate where a qualified person, and I'll explain what that is, may need to be engaged in your project delivery framework. And then I'll close out by laying out some strategies for soil management, sampling, contract specifications, and contract management. This graphic illustrates a typical design project from pre-design to construction. While soil removal takes place in the construction phase, all of the planning requirements that Grace discussed need to be conducted through the design and into the construction phase. As discussed by Grace, you'll need to engage a qualified person to oversee the planning requirements. What is a qualified person? It's a professional geoscientist or professional engineer registered in Ontario with appropriate environmental site assessment experience. It's recommended that you engage this person as soon as possible in the process so that soil sampling and management can be incorporated into the design and tender and then properly overseen during construction. There are different ways a qualified person can be contracted for a given project, since they can fall into multiple levels within the client and contractor hierarchy. This flowchart shows some of the places that a QP is typically retained for large development sites. So acting as the owner's QP for the project leader, a contractor QP, or a QP for the contract administrator who represents the project leader. When structured like this, these multiple levels of QP during the life of a project provide the least risk to the project leader, contractor, and the contract administrator, with each party having experts to advise and navigate the various excess soil regulatory requirements. No matter your chosen delivery model and where you want to have your QP engaged, in terms of design and construction risk management, there are some key steps that we recommend. So firstly, evaluating the contractor QP as part of your tender, retaining your own QP to act on your behalf as the project leader, and establishing appropriate contract administration. So with that, on the next few slides, I'll lay out 4 key steps for managing your risk during project delivery. The very first step to consider is, what is your overall soil management strategy? Firstly, the key to this is to minimize the amount of soil that may become excess to the project by balancing your cut and fill. At the present time, and for the foreseeable future, there's an excess of generating sites compared to receiving sites. And identifying receiving sites is made even more difficult when there is a significant lag between when you generate excess soil and when a receiving site may also be able to accept it. You can overcome this partly by trying to accommodate soil reuse on other sites that you own yourself. So not necessarily within the project area if you will have excess soil, but other projects that you might own. So you have a little bit more control about soil flow then and between generation and then ultimate reuse. You should also consider if you need to be incorporating variances to the setback or stockpile requirements that Grace discussed for on-site management into permits that you already obtained, such as through the conservation authorities, or if you will need additional permits to manage those requirements. Then finally, if you have excess soil, you need to start thinking about where it will go, and you should do that as early as possible. But first, you need to know your soil quality and what the acceptance criteria are for your receiving sites. While you may be allowed to take advantage of certain exemptions, especially when it comes to the amount of sampling, the receiving sites are free to set their own criteria for acceptance as long as they meet or are more stringent than the regulation. So that brings us to our second step, which is to integrate your sampling strategy into your overall soil management strategy. There are three basic approaches here. You can do sampling during design, during construction, or take a hybrid approach, and each has its own risks and benefits. The pros of sampling up front are you will know the quality and what you can plan for. This will also help you identify and inform overall soil management for on your site, as well as potential reuse sites. The drawback to sampling early is you may potentially oversample, as your areas of excess soil and cut fill are probably not 100% known at that time. You also need to be cognizant of the window of time in which sample results will be valid for. With a hybrid approach, you may be able to better balance these concerns, so do some sampling up front and then some sampling later on, sort of pre-construction or during construction, depending on your overall timelines. The third step is to align your strategies with your contract specifications. I'm just waiting for the slide to load here. Perfect. It's not recommended that you rely on templated, generic specifications for your soil management needs, as we have seen over the last year that this can lead to costly delays and extras. Instead, we recommend that you engage a QP to review the project and the specifications and assist not only in identifying those key potential exemptions that you may be able to utilize, but also in developing special provisions that will incorporate the unique needs of your projects. Finally, engaging a QP to detail appropriate contingency scenarios, such as allowing a contractor to propose additional receiving sites into your specifications, will give you that operational flexibility to pivot quickly when you need it. The final step is contract management and establishing clear roles and responsibilities for that. The key part of this is ensuring that your specifications have an appropriate schedule for submittals and a clear submittals approval process. So in my previous example, if a contractor may be allowed to propose a different reuse site than is in the contract, in this case, you'd want to detail in your specs what documentation they need to submit to propose the change, a timeline for the submittal to be completed in advance of any soil movements, and who from a technical and administrative perspective will be responsible for reviewing and approving the change of receiving sites. Not only will this maintain compliance with the regulation, but also keep your project on time and on budget. So in closing, Ontario's on-site and excess soil management regulation contains many new and complex requirements that the industry did not previously have to consider. While there will be a steep learning curve, failure to properly integrate these requirements of the regulation into any project where you're breaking ground can lead to lack of compliance, project delays, cost overruns, and even potentially fines and orders. Therefore, engaging the QP early on in your project as possible would be key to your success. But if you haven't considered it much so far and you have projects on the go, there are still many things you can do. And we're going to talk about that and more in our panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Tiana and Grace, for that excellent overview of the regulation and its implications on various projects. So now we're going to pivot to our panel discussion, and we're going to bring on our three panelists. Erica and I have a few questions for our panelists, but we'll also be keeping an eye on the chat to see if there's questions coming from the audience, and then we will also move to those questions as well as time permits. So I'd like to introduce our three panelists. First, we have Krista Barfoot. Krista has over 25 years of experience and expertise in soil management and site planning. She serves on the CBN and ONEA Excess Soil Technical Committees and also participated in the OSPE Steering Committee for the beneficial reuse of excess soil at aggregate operations. Next, we have Jason Hudson. Jason brings over 20 years of experience in environmental assessment and remediation programs. Jason has worked on environmental projects involving remediation, soil management, and contaminant management for the oil and gas, commercial, insurance, and government sectors. And last but certainly not least, Jill Peters-Deckman. Jill has more than 20 years of experience in environmental consulting, specifically with respect to environmental site assessment programs at contaminated sites. Okay, so first off, I'm going to give this one to Jill. Jill, what are some key takeaways for project leaders, given your experience working with this regulation for 2021 and as we look ahead to some of the changes coming in 2022?
Thanks, Joel. Well, there's certainly a lot of information in this regulation, a lot of points to consider and to figure out how they work for your projects. I think most importantly, I'd like to mention that if the regulation is new to you at this point, the takeaway should be that there's help out there to help you get on track. Assemble the information that you know about your project right now and reach out to a qualified person to get their assistance in coming up with management options. A second point to remember, and we've mentioned it a couple of times already in the presentation, is that regardless of the contracting structure that you have established for your project, as the project leader, you are responsible for making sure that the regulation is followed, and that responsibility can't be downloaded to another party. So that's an important takeaway for the project leaders that are on the call today. Thirdly, there are a variety of soil management options that need to be considered for every project. There's on-site reuse, there are off-site receiving sites, there are management sites and facilities that can be used. As Tiana mentioned, there are some benefits to employing on-site reuse that provides you with relief from the planning and some of the registry requirements, and management of soil becomes more of a due diligence or a liability consideration for you. For off-site placement, there are more steps that you're going to need to go through, but they're certainly not terrible hurdles to get over, and overall being proactive and planning early in the process are really going to be instrumental in helping you achieve successful management of soil for your project.
And I'll just add to that, Joel. I think another big takeaway for project leaders this year is you really do, and Tiana and Grace both touched on this, you really do want to think about how you're setting up your overall project delivery in a way that's strategic and accounts for the different pieces of the regulation. So think about how you are weaving the obligations of the regulation into the whole delivery framework in a way that's cost effective and schedule effective. Really think about what is the best time to engage the qualified person and when should we be doing the sampling. And which party should be contracting the QP? Does it make sense for that to be a project leader contract, or does that make sense to be something that flows through the contractor? And then the other thing is there is some flexibility for variances and options in the regulation. So look within your project to see, do we want to access any of those variances, and how do we go about that, and what's the timelines to do that? So really thinking strategically through how you deliver your project in a way that accounts for the regulation in a cost-effective and a schedule-effective way. The other big thing this year has been very much looking for opportunities to take advantage of the flexibility that has been created by the grandfathering period. Obviously, that's very quickly coming to a close, but I think as we go forward, that will still be something that project leaders will want to do, is look for where there is some flexibility for their project and how do they best take advantage of that.
That's great. Thanks, Krista. Maybe now we could take a bit of time to talk about the registration requirements, as these are going to be new for 2022. Jason, can you explain a bit about what the registry is and how it's going to work?
Yes, Erica, yes, I can. Yes, it is. The registry is going to be administered by, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's called the Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority. I've heard certain abbreviations like RIPRA or RPRA, and it is a registry that's is running at the moment. Essentially, what it's doing is really tracking the distribution of batteries and tires and some hazardous waste. But now it's being brought in line to look at excess soils. For the excess soils, filing of notices are required for moving excess soils off from project sites, from for operating reuse sites, and for these new potential residential development depots as well. For reuse sites, you're required to file if the quantity of soil you're receiving is greater than 10,000 cubic meters. And for project sites, any soils that's leaving the site, then you need to register if it's over 2,000 cubic meters. Who's responsible for filing? Well, it's essentially the project leader, as Grace defined in the slide, but it can be delegated to another party, but it requires a declaration from the project leader that they are delegating that responsibility, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a qualified person, as Tiana mentioned. It could be some other site operating, a contractor or something of that nature. The registry is intended to open on December 1st, so very soon it will be open. And because of the new, the ending of the grandfathering clause, etc., it's going to be operational and required that any of these reuse sites and project sites really need to be registered as of January 1st, 2022. It should be noted that any enforcement, though, is going to be done by the MECP, not by RIPRA. The filing of any notices, essentially what you need to do is just do your initial soil movement based on your assumed cut-fill balance. And as your project proceeds, and there may be a change in the volume that's been moved, you would be required to update it within 30 days of that change, and upon final closeout when the project's finished, within 30 days of the project finishing. There are fixed and variable fees based on the scale and type of movement as well.
Thanks, Jason. Maybe just to piggyback on that with respect to the registry, one of the frequent questions that we get is what information actually needs to be uploaded onto the registry when you file a notice. So we've heard some of those different reports that need to be done as part of the planning requirement. So the assessment of past uses, the sampling and analysis plan, the soil characterization report, and then the excess soil destination report. So those 4 reports are required for the planning stages, but they do not have to be uploaded to the registry. That's not part of the notice. So the notice does require you to input specific information about the project. So it would be a description of the project and the project area. You need to have the contact information for the project leader, for the QP, and any authorized person that has been designated for the notice. And then with as much current information as you have, you need to specify the location and a description of any destination sites that you intend to use. And with respect to those destination sites, you need to estimate the quantity and the quality of the soil that you are going to be taking to each of those sites. So you might have a property where there's some remediation that needs to happen on one part of the property, so that soil is going to go to a landfill or to a waste handling facility, or perhaps a treatment area. So you'll need to designate that, and then perhaps you have another part of the property where the assessment has determined that it meets the excess soil quality standards, maybe the table 2.1 or table 3.1, and so now you have a volume of soil that you're going to take to a receiving site for a beneficial reuse. So then when you file the notice, then you're also going to state how much soil you're going to take to a specific receiving site. And as you mentioned, Jason, if things change, obviously, projects are not static. Receiving sites might change throughout the project. So you are allowed to change as you go, but any changes have to be reflected on the registry within 30 days of any changes. And then you mentioned cost, maybe just to give people a bit of an idea of some of the different types of costs that you can expect with respect to filing on the registry. So there's a separate cost breakdown for a project area that's generating soil. And then there's costs that are also specific to the reuse sites, the receiving sites that will be taking that excess soil. And the costs that are applicable are they're related to the volume of excess soil at your site or at the receiving site. So for smaller projects, which would be considered less than 10,000 cubic meters, it's a $75 flat fee. So that's pretty straightforward. But as you get into larger projects, the costs become variable dependent on the volume of soil that you're exporting. So for example, if you have around 40,000 cubic meters of soil that you need to export from your site, the fee to file the notice is $1,000. And then if you're what we would probably consider a very large project, if you're looking to move 150,000 cubic meters, then the fee to file the notice would be $7,500. So that's with respect to project areas, generating sites. So with respect to the reuse or the receiving site that are taking that excess soil, those are flat fees to register on the registry, to file a notice on the registry, and those flat fees can range between $750 for smaller sites and all the way up to $10,000 for very large sites that are receiving in excess of 5 million cubic meters. So again, there's a scaling up for the cost for both project areas and for the receiving sites. Yeah, so speaking about receiving sites, maybe we can dig into that a little bit more. And I did notice that there was a question in the chat about receiving sites. So Mark, I noticed you had a question, and we were going to pose this to our panel as well. So hopefully this addresses your question. Because Tiana did mention that in the presentation as well, that there's going to be some challenges in finding receiving sites. So Krista, can you share some of your thoughts on how to overcome some of these challenges with respect to receiving sites moving forward?
Yeah, for sure. So we always say to people, first off, what I would most encourage is look amongst your own projects and your own sites and see if there are opportunities for beneficial reuse amongst your own projects. It's obviously easy to move and reuse soils across sites that you already have access to and control over. So if that's an option for you, if you have multiple sites, I'd say look there first as potential receiving sites. From there, the next thing that is often looked at now is we're seeing people proactively seek out and enter into agreement with specific reuse sites. So we do see project leaders doing this by directly connecting with fill sites that are known to them through other projects. And we're also seeing in some cases project leaders that will actually put a tender out to seek out fill sites. So they're looking to very proactively establish some kind of agreement with the receiving site. So they have some closure and certainty around that, since I know right now there's a lot of risk associated with where we're sending soils. Another option, kind of failing those two things, is to start reaching out to soil brokers. We do see an emerging market here of vendors popping up that are actively advertising themselves as supporting finding receiving sites. And these vendors do seem to be actively tracking and documenting reuse sites and disposal sites. So that's another really good option or a good resource for potentially finding receiving sites.
I'd like to chime in with a couple of other options that are available. Once the registry is live and receiving sites are using it to register themselves, the registry itself will become a tool that we can use to search and look for receiving site options. So that will become available in the near future. And there's always the option of using your existing network. There's a lot of power in the connections that you already have, and going out and finding out what else is on the go locally. So don't forget about reaching out to the contractors that you know, the consultants that you've worked with, other peers that you have in the industry, other parties that you know that are managing sites. There's a lot of power in that network, and it should help you as another resource to finding a receiving site.
And I'll just chime in there. I think the other piece to Mark's question was, we noted in our presentation that it can't go to landfill, and I think that's maybe something just to clarify, that in the short term that is still an option, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's 2025 when that kicks in.
Yeah, January 1st, 2025, yeah.
And you should note that that's very quality dependent. So if it meets a certain quality criteria, it will no longer be allowed to be shipped for landfill, I think, unless it's being used for cover material of some sort. So there's some allowances there, but it's very quality driven. If your quality is not conducive to finding a reuse site, then landfilling would still be an option.
That's right. Okay, we have a question in the chat about liquid soil. I'm going to throw this to Grace. So the question from Jonathan: do excess liquid soils derived from hydrovac daylighting need to be assessed after excavation, or is it based on in situ concentrations?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. It actually can be assessed in situ. If you're clear on where the soil is going to be generated with your hydrovacing operations, then by all means, testing in situ before you do that work is acceptable. What the ministry does not want to see is wet samples. So what they want your testing results to reflect dry soil conditions. So it is best actually to go in situ. You also can benefit from perhaps fewer samples required if you do your in situ testing ahead of time rather than doing a pile later on. So hopefully that helps to answer your question.
Great, thanks, Grace. The next question we have is from Jeff, and it's asking, how does this regulation impact sites with existing ECAs or environmental compliance approvals that might have conditions governing this already? Maybe Krista, is that something you can answer?
Sure. So there's lots of allowances in the reg for site-specific instruments that already exist, and it might not just be ECAs. I know some sites will have a CPU. So there is definitely language in the reg that accounts for site-specific instruments that might be in place. So the ECA conditions, in often cases, and it would depend very specifically on what it is, might actually rule. Like I know there's sections in the regulation that basically say if you have an ECA or some site-specific instrument that dictates a different quality or different quantity, then that would take precedent over what's required in the regulation. So you'd really have to look specifically at what your ECA is and what it says, but there are definitely allowances in the regulation to account for instruments that might already be in place or maybe put in place by other bodies as well.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well. There's also permits and bylaws with municipalities also apply. So there might be some other instruments other than, ECAs and CPUs that we're more familiar with that may apply for soil management purposes.
Okay, thanks, Jason, for following up on that. I'm going to move to a question in the chat about infrastructure and some of the exemptions that may be applicable there. So this question's from Andrea. Tiana, I'm going to flip this one to you, okay? The question is, can you provide some comment regarding the exemptions to keep infrastructure in safe working order? There doesn't seem to be much guidance from MECP to which types of projects this would apply. Is this left up to the QP?
It's really left up to the project leader, but our understanding from discussions with the ministry is that that exemption is intended to address low risk, small volume type of repair projects. And what is called the exemption is to maintain infrastructure in a fit state of repair. So things like repairing a valve, repairing or replacing a valve, or for example, perhaps doing some integrity digs would probably fall under that. And then as you scale up, really, it's not really meant to allow for that. So you should be considering the planning requirements with that. I think that's another, oh, go ahead, Grace.
I was just going to echo that and just say, So any kind of expansion of a roadway or new construction would not fall into that category per the ministry's guidance.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got another question, looks like from Aaron. Keen to understand if there are any opportunities to delegate project leader duties to contractors, or must it all stay with the owner? Jill, is that something that you want to take a first crack at?
Sure. So I did mention, and we've mentioned it a couple of times already, that responsibility is retained by the project leader to ensure that the regulation is being followed. That's almost from a liability perspective. The tasks that are associated with following the regulation can be shared amongst a consultant or a contractor. You can certainly task them with the activities, but ultimately, I guess in the scenario where something goes wrong, it is the project leader who is retaining the liability for ensuring that the regulation was followed.
And I'll just jump in and add a bit to that, Joel. And that essentially what that means practically is that if things go wrong and your soil ends up someplace it shouldn't, it means the ministry is levying orders on you as the project leader. And that's not to say they won't also name others. The ministry can name whomever they want in an order. But ultimately the responsibility from the ministry's eyes remains on the project leader, because you have the best opportunity to be in charge of what happens to your soil. So absolutely, you can enter contracts with others and download tasks and responsibilities to others. And should they fail in those, you absolutely, through civil court, can challenge that and go after them for compensation. But under the regulation, as far as the ministry is concerned, the liability remains with the project owner. So if there's an issue, the order will come at you.
Thanks. There's a question here from Linda that I think is regarding something Jill mentioned in her portion of the discussion earlier. So it's that if soil's being managed on site, there are still requirements you need to follow as part of the reg, and looking for clarification on what those requirements would be. Tiana, is that something you can speak to?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is soil management and excess soil. So there are things on site that you need to be considering, and it really has to do with once you're excavating your soil and you're storing it, you need to be doing that in an environmentally responsible manner. So the regulation does set things such as setbacks from water bodies, as well as setbacks from property boundaries, and then stockpile sizes. So your stockpile sizes can exceed 2,500 cubic meters. In general, you need to respect a 10-meter setback from property boundaries with a few exemptions, and then a 30-meter setback from water bodies. If you cannot meet this, there are some opportunities to vary that through different instruments. So that is a change that came in December of last year, so that's very favorable, because before they were non-negotiable.
Okay, thanks, Tiana. We noticed that someone had made a comment about the fee schedule with respect to filing notices on the registry, and that the latest information from RIPRA is that those specific fees have not been finalized yet, but I think our expectation is that they would be within the range of what we had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's my understanding, Joel. When I attended their session, I think they had already spoken to all the stakeholders and they were pretty set on their fees. Obviously they're not final, but I think they're pretty final. We're getting pretty much down to the wire really for the implementation of the registry. So I think they're likely to stay as they've suggested in their presentations.
Yeah. Okay, but thanks for that comment, Manisha. We appreciate that input. If we can just move ahead then to the next question from Lee Howell. If excess material, not considered as soil, so it's in excess of 2 millimeters in diameter, as Grace had mentioned in the presentation. So here we're talking about gravels, coarse sand, pea gravel as well maybe would fall into this. Do the requirements of Reg 406 apply to that excess material? If not, is there any other regulation requirement other than perhaps Reg 347, the waste regulation? Grace, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So definitely if it's greater than 2 millimeters diameter, and I want to comment actually that coarse sand would probably still fall in that 2 meter, less than 2 millimeter classification, but a pea gravel certainly, or some kind of a gravel only product would not fall under the soil, excess soil, on-site soil category. So it would be exempt from the regulations requirements. As for other regulated management, maybe someone else can jump in about what might apply there, but I was, definitely the waste regulation, you want to make sure if it's some kind of a commercial product that can be sort of managed under that definition, then you can certainly go that route. But yeah, if someone else has something to jump in on.
Yeah, I was just going to go, it goes to the definition a little bit, but also about, there's a perception that aggregates are exempt. So, you've got to be careful if you're on a site and you've got a mixture of soil and some historical aggregates that have been placed on site. This could still be classed as excess soil. So it's okay to reuse it on your site, but if you're looking to move it off site, there's going to be challenges there. So you really need to reevaluate what the soil classification of that material is based on, what's happened with it since it's been placed at that site.
Great, thanks. So the next question's an interesting one, and maybe, so the question here is, are there going to be any cost controls in place for receiving sites, or can they hold projects hostage? So, I mean, I think part of that is, there are a number of sites that need the soil anyways, right? So it's probably not to their advantage to do so. But a good discussion point. Maybe Krista, if I can direct that one to you.
Yeah, I haven't heard of this. I mean, I'm hearing all sorts of challenges with receiving sites, and I'm hearing about receiving sites. So the last comment about rock, like asking for analytical data for what is clearly not soil material would be stone, and our standards are not specific to stone material. So there's a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of need to probably reach out and engage receiving sites and make sure they understand the regulation as well. I don't know of cases where receiving sites are just jacking up prices and making it possible. I do think it's an open market, and like I said, we're seeing soil brokers come to the table. People are seeing the opportunity for business development and growth. I think we'll see that on the receiving site side too. And there are receiving sites that need fill. Like, they will be looking for high quality fill for their sites, and I'm sure they'll be looking to go into agreements. I know that this whole concept of getting some clarity on your receiving site is to everybody's advantage. And so I would say, to avoid that, look for those opportunities to engage in contracts and engage in agreements with the receiving site at the front end, and then you can avoid thinking you've got something set up and then it kind of falling through at the last minute.
Yeah, thanks, Krista. And I think this next question, it speaks to receiving sites as well. So I guess in this case, Jessica's question was, if you're exempt from registering, for example, an infrastructure project or otherwise, will project leaders still be able to view the registry to see what receiving sites are out there and to be able to take their soils? So that registry is going to be public, right? So
So Erica, I was on the seminar this morning that Manisa was on as well. And so basically the registry is to go live December 1st. So that's sort of the last information we have is as of December 1st, the registry is live. Anybody can set up an account. It's one account per company, essentially, that should be set up, or one account per CRA number. They were clear on that. And you can set up an account without actually having a site to register as of yet. You can go in and register yourself on the account. It is a public account, so there will be things that can be seen. There are things that are not going to be able to be visible in the registry as well. So there is some controls over what information is shared and what isn't. But I would say, even if you are not having to register a project notice for whatever reason, you can go in and set up an account, and then you would be able to peruse what is publicly accessible in the site, whether you're filing a notice or not.
Thanks, Krista. We've got another question from Lee. It's about reuse sites again. Do we think, given our current knowledge of management of soils in Ontario, that there may be a net of excess of soil unable to find reuse sites? If this occurs, how will excess material be managed? Shipped to transfer or soil bank sites only and sit there? Could these then become landfills for excess soil? Yeah, any thoughts on that? Jill, maybe you want to take a first crack at that one?
Well, I guess it's certainly a worry. We do expect that there are going to be more sites generating soils, certainly initially, versus the number of receiving sites that are available. So it is going to be very important to work within that network that you have, work with the consultants, QPs, to try and figure out what the options are with contractors as well, to figure out what those options are going to be if you're having difficulty finding a home for your excess soils. I don't think that there's a great answer, frankly, to what will happen to your soil if you can't find a receiving site for it. That's something that we're going to see being worked out as we spend more time working under this regulation. Those Class 1 and Class 2 management sites may have to become more of an option. They do certainly have some timelines associated with them, so how long the material can stay at those transfer sites before it finds a final resting place will certainly be an issue. I think the regulation does have those timelines in place so that those management sites can't become landfills.
I'll just add to that, Joel, because this question about what are the sinks going to be has been out there for, I want to say, the 5 or 6 years that we've been working on evolving this regulation. It's always been the question is, where are the sinks ultimately? I think we've often, especially in Ontario, had a situation where we're generating more soil than we reuse. So I don't think this is really a new problem. It's just because there's a lot more boundaries around how we manage it. We're all becoming far more aware of it. And I think what we will see and what we are starting to see is, again, similar to the soil brokers, this recognition that there is an opportunity, there's a market here. So we might see, people putting forward applications for Class 1 sites, people putting forward applications for soil processing facilities, for temporary sites. I think we'll also see the industry start to get strategic to think about how do we reuse or leave more soil in place on our sites and minimize the extent to which we're actually generating excess soil. So I think we'll see a lot of things emerging over the next couple of years, but there will be growing pains. There will be growing pains as this reg kicks in for sure.
Thanks. Yeah, we just have a few minutes left here. There's a couple of questions on the same theme, so maybe if we can quickly try to address a couple more, and then we'll wrap up before we run out of time. So there's a few questions just with regards to stockpiling and site restrictions. We've mentioned the 2,500 cubic meters, and a couple of questions just around what kind of variances are required or how we might be able to manage that. Does somebody want to tackle that question?
I could start on it, Erica, just because we've had this come up specifically on projects, and definitely site plan approval is one means of getting that, and probably for most projects, it's probably the easiest one. So if you can know in your site plan stage that you're going to want a variance to that, I would say you build that right into your site plan approval application. That's probably the cleanest and easiest way to do it. But there are a suite of other instruments that can be used. I see Steve's asking about MECP approval. Yes, there's MECP instruments as well. ECAs can be used. There's kind of a suite that the ministry has pointed to of options for doing that. So there is probably about 5 different potential site-specific instruments you could use to get that variance, and it's a matter of figuring out which one works for your project.
Yeah, and I would also kick in for stockpiling near property boundaries. There's a little bit of flexibility built into the reg without need for a variance. If you can put a permanent barrier, there's some things there. Working in public road right-of-ways, there's some exceptions to some of those rules.
Thanks. Maybe just one more question before we wrap up. It's with regards to excess materials other than soil, so asphalt, concrete from demolition. Question from Craig, assuming that these are not affected by the regulation since they are not soil and already have specific requirements for handling?
So that's correct. This regulation isn't addressing that. This regulation is very specific to soil and what they call crushed rocks or mixes of things with soil. So no, you're right. Concrete and asphalt will remain regulated under the current framework.
Great, thanks. I know there's a few questions we haven't got to yet, but for those who have posted questions, we can, looks like we probably need to wrap up, so we can follow up on those later. Before we sign off, I just wanted to take maybe a couple of minutes to go around with our panelists and share maybe sort of a key point for yourself or something you want people to take as a takeaway from this moving forward under the new regulation. So kind of starting from the top, maybe if we start with you, Krista, one key piece of advice for folks to consider.
Yeah, I would say never underestimate the importance of planning with this new regulation. You can save yourself a lot of grief and a lot of risk and liability if you make sure you're thinking about soil management at the front end of the project and not thinking of it as this back end thing that you just deal with once construction starts. So planning, I'd say planning is the big thing.
Thanks. Jason?
Most important thing, I think one of the most important thing is to retain a suitable and suitably qualified QP. They're key, as Tiana mentioned, throughout the whole process, construction to design. So, make sure you've got a QP.
Perfect, thanks. Jill?
Yeah, well, I think it's really whether you're a soil generator or a receiver, the contracting process that you establish for your project is going to be very important. So making sure that it's tailored specifically to your project is an important takeaway.
Thanks. Grace.
Yeah, and remember the regulation isn't just for excess soil. There are aspects that cover your on-site soil management as well.
Perfect, yeah, like the stockpiles. And finish off with Tiana.
For me, it's exemptions. So just being really knowledgeable about the exemptions, because being exempt, usually you're just exempt from certain aspects of the regulation, but then also being strategic about them. So engaging your QP so that you can take advantage of them and utilize them appropriately.
That's great. Those are all great key takeaways, and hopefully that's helpful as we wrap this up. Just want to thank you very much to each of our panelists, Jason, Krista, Grace, Jill, Tiana. You did an excellent job leading us through that, and we really appreciate that. So to those of you attending, please feel free to reach out directly to any of our panelists or to Erica or myself if you have any further questions, and we'd be happy to talk more about your specific project requirements. So thank you for attending. Obviously, we wouldn't be doing this without you, so thank you for being here. As an attendee, you will receive a follow-up email with some information regarding this presentation and from our excess soil team. And as Erica mentioned, we will follow up with those who had posed questions that we did not have time for. We'd also appreciate any feedback that you might have on the presentation, or if you have some thoughts on future presentation material that you would be interested in. So with that, until next time, thanks again for attending, and we wish you all the very best. Take care.